At 75, I've learned that seduction has nothing to do with those stories they used to tell in my youth. Sitting here on my porch, observing the street movement and people passing by, I realize that true charm lies in the small things, in the genuine connections we make throughout life. I remember the day I met Mrs. Smith at the water aerobics group. She was alone, a bit lost looking for the pool. Instead of simply giving directions, I offered to accompany her. Along the way, we discovered we shared a love for Italian cuisine. What started with a simple conversation about pasta turned into a friendship that has lasted 5 years. I no longer use those tactics I used to see in old movies, that forced way of speaking, the studied poses. Today, my seduction is in the sincere smile I offer when greeting the building's doorman, Mr. Johnson, every morning. It's in the genuine attention I dedicate when my 12-year-old granddaughter, Emily, tells me about her day at school. It's amazing how she gets excited when she realizes I'm truly interested in her stories about science class. Last week, during breakfast at the farmer's market, a ritual I've maintained for years, I met an old work colleague, Robert. Instead of a superficial conversation about the weather, we shared memories from the time we worked together at the old textile factory. I realized how my life experience allows me to create deeper connections. I don't need to impress anyone. The stories I carry naturally spark interest. I've learned to value the power of gentle touch, like when I hold my younger sister's hand during our Sunday afternoon conversations. These aren't rehearsed gestures, but natural expressions of affection and presence. It's funny how people respond positively when you show genuine interest in their lives. My joy today comes from different places. It comes from the pleasure of teaching my grandson Peter to play checkers, even when he wins, which is happening more and more frequently. It comes from participating in the church choir, not because I'm an excellent singer, far from it, but because I love seeing how music brings people together. The other day, I was at the supermarket when I saw a lady trying to reach a product on a high shelf. Instead of simply grabbing the item for her, I asked about her day, commented on the changes in the neighborhood, and we ended up having a delightful conversation about how local businesses have transformed over the past decades. She told me fascinating stories about the old bakery that used to exist, where there's now a pharmacy. The generosity I've learned to cultivate has nothing to do with money. It's about listening, truly listening, when someone needs to vent. It's about sharing my mother's old recipes with younger neighbors who have never tasted that cornmeal cake made in a wood stove. It's about giving advice only when asked, and even then, with the humility of someone who knows that everyone has their own path. The confidence I have today is very different from what I had at 30. I remember how anxious I was to prove my worth at work, always worried about what others thought. Now sitting in my favorite armchair flipping through family albums, I realize that each wrinkle on my face tells a story of overcoming. I've been through difficult times, like when I lost my job at 50 due to factory automation. At the time, it seemed like the end of the world, but it was precisely this experience that taught me to reinvent myself. I started making homemade cakes to sell, using the recipes my mother taught me. What started as a necessity turned into a small family business. Today, my eldest daughter runs the bakery that was born in our kitchen. Every morning, when I look in the mirror, I see beyond the marks of time. I see the man who raised 3 children alone after Mary, my wife, left too soon. I see someone who learned to cook, to iron, to braid the girls' hair for school. It wasn't easy, but each challenge made me stronger. At 60, I decided to go back to school. Not out of necessity, but for pleasure. I enrolled in a gardening course at the community center. There I met Mrs. Thompson, who became my partner in community garden projects. She taught me about medicinal herbs, while I shared my knowledge about composting, something I learned from my father. Technology, which used to scare me, is now part of my routine. My grandchildren taught me how to use a cell phone, and now I make video calls with my sister who lives in Denver. At first it was frustrating. How many times did I freeze the device? But the patience of the little ones and my persistence paid off. Just yesterday, I managed to make my first online purchase. Over the years, I've learned that true power isn't in controlling situations or people, but in accepting who we are. I remember the day I decided to stop dyeing my hair. It was liberating. The white strands that used to bother me so much are now part of my identity, just like the stories I carry. In the park's exercise group, I'm the only man among 15 women. At first, I felt out of place, but soon realized that didn't matter. What mattered was the movement, the joy of starting the day with exercises and good conversations. Mrs. Wilson, our 68-year-old teacher, always says there's no age to start something new. I learned to say no too. When my youngest son insisted that I move to a smaller apartment, I explained lovingly that I preferred to stay in the house where I raised my family. Here, I can take care of my garden, receive my friends for dominoes on Saturday afternoons, and keep Mary's memory alive in every corner. One of the greatest discoveries was realizing that I could contribute to my community. I started giving woodworking classes to neighborhood youth. Seeing them learning to transform wood into art fills me with pride. Jack, a 15-year-old boy, told me that our classes helped him choose his profession. He wants to be a furniture designer. Every Sunday, I gather my children and grandchildren for a family lunch. I prepare that bean stew I learned from my mother while the children play in the backyard. It's in these moments that I realize how precious time is. I no longer worry about serving perfect dishes or keeping the house spotless. What matters is being together. Last week, my oldest granddaughter, Anna, asked me what it was like to be old. I replied that each day is a discovery. I told her about how I learned to ride a bicycle at 70 because I wanted to accompany my grandchildren on weekend rides. I talked about the joy of being able to sleep in without guilt, of having time to observe the birds that visit my garden every morning. Aging has taught me to value silence. That rush that consumed me in my youth has given way to a pleasant calm. I've learned to appreciate a cup of coffee without needing to do anything else but feel its aroma. I discovered the pleasure of watching the sunrise from my porch, listening to the birds singing. Of course, there are challenges. Sometimes my knees complain when I climb stairs, and I need glasses even to read newspaper headlines. But each limitation has taught me to find new ways. When I could no longer run, I discovered swimming. When tired eyes made reading difficult, I discovered audiobooks. One of the greatest joys of my age is being able to be a bridge between the past and the present. When my grandchildren ask me what life was like back then, I tell them about how we played in the street until dark, about the summer festivals that lasted all night, about how we made our own toys. Last week, I organized a kite workshop at the community center. Seeing children and teenagers fascinated, learning something that was part of my childhood was exciting. Michael, my 8-year-old grandson, couldn't believe his grandfather knew how to make a kite fly so high. The other day, organizing old photographs in the family album, I found one from 1970 when I still worked as a laborer in the textile factory. I spent hours there, lost in memories. I remembered Mr. Thompson, my first boss, who taught me that a job well done needs no praise. It speaks for itself. It was in that factory that I learned one of the most valuable lessons of my life. In 1985, we made a serious mistake in an important delivery. Everyone was afraid to take responsibility, but I decided to present myself to the supervisor. To my surprise, instead of punishment, I received an opportunity to lead a project to improve our quality control processes. Today, when my grandchildren complain about some mistake they made at school, I tell this story. I teach them that our failures can be the beginning of something extraordinary. As I always say, the fear of making mistakes should not be greater than the desire to get it right. My garden is my refuge and my greatest pride. Each plant has a story. The red roses came from cuttings that Mary planted 30 years ago. The jabuticaba tree was a gift from my father when we moved to this house. The orchids remind me of my mother, who had a special gift for making any flower bloom. Every morning, I wake up early to take care of the plants. It's my form of meditation. As I water each one, I talk to my memories. Sometimes I find myself telling the flowers about how yesterday was, or sharing concerns about a child or grandchild. Last year, I decided to transform part of the backyard into a community garden. I invited the neighbors to participate, and to my surprise, the project united 3 generations. Mrs. Davis brings her natural seasoning recipes, while the neighborhood children learn about the plant cycle and the importance of caring for nature. At 72, I discovered painting. It all started when I accompanied my granddaughter Beatrice to an arts fair in the square. There was a gentleman selling watercolors, and I was fascinated by the colors and shapes he created on paper. That same week, I bought my first painting kit. At first, my attempts were clumsy. Trees that looked more like green blots, crooked houses, people out of proportion. But there was something liberating about creating, about letting colors express what words couldn't always say. Now I have a small studio in what used to be the girls' room. The walls are covered with my works, some good, others not so much, but all important. Each painting tells a story. The sunset I saw on the beach with my grandchildren, the garden on a rainy day, the portrait of Mary I made based on our wedding photo. I've learned to value the quiet days, those where nothing extraordinary happens. It's on these days that I find time to reflect on life, to be grateful for the small miracles of everyday life. Breakfast on the porch, the Sunday newspaper, the unexpected phone call from an old friend. I've been keeping a diary for 5 years. In it, I record not just the events of the day, but mainly the feelings, reflections, dreams I still want to fulfill. It's my way of leaving a legacy for my family, of showing that each day lived is an important page in our story. In the pages of this diary, I tell about the first time I saw the sea at 45 with my children still small. I write about the day Mary left, about how I learned to live with longing without letting it prevent me from living. I record the small daily victories, like when I managed to learn how to make a transfer through the bank app, or when I finally mastered Grandma's cheese bread recipe. I was never much into dancing, I confess. Mary always complained at parties because I only knew how to shuffle my feet on the dance floor. But at 73, something unexpected happened. During a party at the community center, Mrs. Taylor, an 80-year-old lady full of vigor, pulled me to dance foro. "It's never too late to learn," she said with that contagious smile. And so began my journey in dance. Every Thursday, there I was in the ballroom dancing group for seniors. At first it was just embarrassment and stepped-on feet. Today I'm proud to say that I know how to lead a partner in samba, bolero, and even waltz. Dancing taught me that our body has memories that go beyond the mind's recollections. Each step, each turn, makes me feel more alive. And the best part, I made wonderful friends. After classes, our group always has coffee at the corner bakery, where we share stories and laughter. My home office has become a kind of memory library. On the shelves, besides the books I've been collecting for years, I keep small treasures. The first ceramic frog my daughter Anna made in school, my father's pocket watch, the letters I exchanged with Mary during our courtship. Each object tells a story. Grandpa John's broken pipe reminds me of the afternoons when he used to tell me ghost stories. My mother's silver thimble transports me to the days when she sewed our school uniforms. The incomplete sticker album from the '58 World Cup makes me smile remembering the trades at the school gate. The other day, my grandson, Peter, 10 years old, spent the afternoon with me rummaging through these old things, as he called them. To my surprise, he was fascinated by each story. He asked to take one of the old letters to show at school for a project about communication before the internet. Seeing the past gain meaning through his eyes was a unique experience. The kitchen has always been the heart of our home. It was there that Mary taught me how to make rice without burning it, after several disastrous attempts, where my daughters learned their first recipes, where we celebrated every birthday, every achievement. After I became a widower, the kitchen became my refuge. I started rescuing old family recipes. My mother's recipe notebook, with its yellowed pages and grease stains, became my guide. Each dish has a story. The cornmeal cake she made on rainy days, the chicken with okra that was tradition for Sunday lunches, the papaya sweet that only she knew how to make just right. Now, every Saturday, I give cooking classes to my grandchildren. I teach not just the recipes, but the stories behind them. While we knead bread or season beans, I tell them about what life was like in the countryside, about the 4th of July celebrations of my childhood, about afternoon teas at Grandma's house. With age, I've learned that time is our most precious asset. Not that clock time which always runs in a hurry, but the time of experiences, of affections, of small daily joys. I created a ritual for myself. Every night, before going to bed, I write down 3 things I'm grateful for. Sometimes they're important events, like the birth of a great-grandchild. Other times they're simple moments, the taste of breakfast, a phone call from a distant friend, the sound of rain on the window. This exercise helps me realize that each day is a gift, regardless of the challenges it brings. Even on difficult days when back pains tighten or the longing for Mary gets stronger, I find reasons to be thankful. It started as a simple meeting to play dominoes. Me and 3 other friends from the neighborhood, Sebastian, the former bakery owner, George, a retired teacher, and Milton, who worked at the post office for 35 years. Every Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, we would gather on my porch. But what was just a game turned into something much bigger. Between one move and another, we shared our stories, fears, and hopes. Sebastian would tell us about his granddaughter who was studying medicine. George shared his concerns about his wife, who was fighting Alzheimer's. Milton made us laugh with his stories from the time he delivered letters. Over time, our group grew. Neighbors started showing up, bringing coffee and cookies. The neighborhood children would come after school, curious to learn the game. Soon, Thursdays became an event everyone looked forward to. It was no longer about winning or losing at dominoes. It was about belonging, about being part of a community. Even after 10 years since her passing, I still write letters to Mary. I started this as a way to deal with longing, but it became an important ritual in my life. Every Sunday night I sit at the desk and tell her about my week. I write about small achievements. Mary, you won't believe it, but I finally learned how to make that pudding you liked so much. I tell her about the grandchildren. Emily is just like you when she's angry. She even crosses her arms the same way. I share my concerns. I've been worried about John. He's been very quiet lately. These letters are never sent, of course. I keep them all in a blue box, the one you gave me on our first wedding anniversary. It's my way of keeping our conversation alive, of feeling that I can still share my life with you. I've always been an early riser, a habit I brought from the countryside. But it was only after 70 that I discovered the beauty of mornings in the city. I started meeting other early birds during my walks in the park. Mr. Frank, who sells bread at the fair, Mrs. Connie, who takes care of the stray cats, and Dr. Paul, a retired doctor who now dedicates himself to photography. We formed an informal group we call the Early Birds Club. We meet at 5:30 in the morning, when the city is still waking up. We walk together, talk about life, and end up having coffee at Joe's Bakery, which opens its doors especially for us. On these mornings, I learn about photography from Dr. Paul, about the neighborhood's history from Mr. Frank, and about compassion from Mrs. Connie. These are lessons that don't come in books, but from the wisdom accumulated by each one over the years. Once a month, I go to the neighborhood's public school to participate in the Storytellers Project. Along with other elderly people from the community, we share with the children stories from our childhood, popular legends and old tales. Seeing the children's eyes sparkle when I tell them about what life was like without television, internet or cell phones is a unique experience. They are especially fascinated by stories about how we played on the street until late, made our own toys, and gathered to listen to radio dramas. But the most interesting thing is to realize how these stories create bridges between generations. After the sessions, there's always a child who comes to tell me how their grandfather or grandmother also has similar stories. It's as if, through these narratives, we help keep our community's memory alive. In the drawer of my dresser, I keep a special notebook. It's not a common recipe book, although it started that way. It's what I call my life recipe book. In it, besides the family's traditional recipes, I write down small lessons I've learned over the years. Between Grandma's cheese bread recipe and Maria's cornmeal cake, there are reflections like, for a lasting marriage, 1 cup of patience, 2 tablespoons of understanding, a pinch of humor and love to taste. Or even, for difficult days, mix 3 sincere smiles, a walk in the fresh air and conversations with friends. Let it rest and repeat if necessary. My granddaughters love to flip through this notebook. Anna, the oldest, always says she'll make one like it when she's older. But Grandpa, she asked me one day, how do you know which life recipes are important? I replied that it's like in the kitchen. Sometimes you follow the recipe to the letter, other times you improvise. But the important thing is to put love into everything you do. Every day when I shave, I have a silent conversation with the man in the mirror. I observe each wrinkle, each mark that time has left, and remember the story behind each one. The scar on the chin, from the day I fell off the bike while teaching my youngest son to ride. The laugh lines around the eyes, from laughing so much with my grandchildren. I remember when I saw my first grey hair, at 35. At the time I was worried, thinking I was aging too fast. Maria laughed and said they were wisdom strands. Today, at 75, I understand what she meant. Each white hair represents a lesson learned, an experience lived. It all started when I met Mr. Albert at the Municipal Library. We were looking for the same book, Dom Casmurro by Machado de Assis. We started talking about literature and discovered that we shared a love for Brazilian classics. We decided to create a book club especially for retirees. We meet every Monday at the library. Each week one of us chooses a book to discuss. It's not just about literature. We talk about how the stories connect with our own life experiences. Miss Celeste, a retired Portuguese teacher, teaches us about the technical aspects of the works. Mr. Robert, who worked as a carpenter all his life, surprises us with unique interpretations relating the stories to his manual work. And me, well, I contribute with my bar philosophies, as my friends joke. One of the biggest lessons I've learned with age is about the importance of unspoken words. When young, I thought I needed to have an opinion on everything, that I always needed to say something. Today I've learned the value of silence, of attentive listening. Sometimes when my children come to ask for advice, I just listen. Not because I have nothing to say, but because I understood that often people don't need solutions. They just need someone to listen without judging. Last week, my youngest daughter was anxious about problems at work. Instead of giving advice, I served coffee, sat beside her and just listened. In the end, she hugged me and said, "Dad, you always know what to do." Little does she know that I did nothing. I just created a safe space for her to find her own answers. There's a special bed in my garden that I call the Second Chances bed. It's where I take care of plants that others have given up on, orchids that stopped blooming, yellowed ferns, cacti that barely survived the winter. I started this after receiving a withered rose bush from the neighbor. "It's dying," she said. "Maybe you can save it." With patience and daily care, I saw that rose bush come back to life. Today, it gives the most beautiful roses in the garden. This experience taught me a lot about life. Just like plants, sometimes we need someone who believes in us, who gives us a second chance. It was like that when I went back to studying at 65. Many thought it was too late, but my family supported me. Every Sunday, I wake up earlier than usual. It's a habit I've kept for decades. I prepare a hearty coffee, get the newspaper at the door, and sit on the porch to watch the day dawn. On these silent mornings, I take stock of the week. I think about the good moments, my newborn great-grandson's smile, the new recipe I learned to make, the surprise phone call from an old friend. I also reflect on the challenges, the medical appointment that worried me, the discussion with my son about my finances, the longing that sometimes tightens in my chest. It's at this moment that I write small letters to my grandchildren. I don't send them all, some I keep for when they're older. In them, I share not just family stories, but also the lessons that life has taught me. In 2020, during the pandemic, I started a special project. I transformed Maria's old sewing room into a library of memories. On the walls, I hung old photographs in chronological order, creating a timeline of our family. Each photograph has a handwritten story on a small card. The wedding photo, 1968, the day Maria said yes and changed my life forever. The first house, 1970. We barely had furniture, but it was our little corner of happiness. The birth of the children, the grandchildren's first steps, family parties. But it's not just happy moments. There are also photos from difficult times. The flood that almost destroyed our house in 1983, the hospital where Maria spent her last days, the first Christmas without her. Because I learned that our story is made of joys and sorrows, and each moment shaped us into who we are today. One of the greatest discoveries I made with age is that time is a patient teacher. It teaches us lessons that no book can convey. I learned that happiness is in the little things, in the smell of fresh coffee, in the sound of rain on the window, in a tight hug from a grandchild. That the best conversations happen unhurriedly, usually accompanied by a homemade cake and a cup of coffee. I discovered that forgiving is not a single act, but a daily process. That longing can be a gentle companion, reminding us of the love we were lucky to live, that our scars tell stories of overcoming, not just of pain. I've always been a man of music. In my youth, I played guitar at church parties. With Maria, we danced in the living room after the children were asleep. But it was only after 70 that I learned to appreciate silence. Now I have a ritual, Every late afternoon, I sit in my favorite armchair, the one Maria chose so many years ago, and stay silent for an hour. It's not meditation, as my daughter Anna suggests. It's more a moment of communion with myself. In this silence, I hear things that the noise of everyday life hides. The ticking of the old clock inherited from my father, the wind in the leaves of the jabuticaba tree, the church bell in the distance. These are sounds that tell stories, that connect me with who I was and who I am. I have a peculiar collection. They're not stamps, coins, or miniature cars. I collect moments. In an old shoebox, I keep small treasures that represent special days. The movie ticket from when I took my grandchildren to the cinema for the first time, the hummingbird feather I found in the garden on a spring morning, the affectionate note my neighbor left along with an apple pie. Each item has a date and a small description. April 23rd, 2023, first time I heard my great-grandson call me Grandpa Joe. June 15th, 2023, the day I managed to make cheese bread just like Maria's. To some, they may seem worthless things, but to me, they are treasures that remind me that life is made up of small, extraordinary moments disguised as ordinary ones. It started when I fixed Mr. Manuel's old radio. Soon, the news spread around the neighborhood. Mr. Joe fixes things. Gradually, neighbors started bringing their broken objects, not just appliances, but also memories that needed repair. We formed an informal group. Every Wednesday, we gather in my improvised workshop in the garage. Mr. Pedro, a former carpenter, teaches about woodwork. I contribute with my basic electronics knowledge, learned from my factory days. Miss Teresa, who was a seamstress, helps with fabric repairs, but we don't just fix objects. Between one soldering and another, we also mend stories, dreams, and broken hearts. As Mr. Manuel says, here we fix everything, except the time that passes. With age, I learned that wealth is not measured only by bank balance. Of course, I've always been careful with money, a habit I inherited from my parents. But I discovered that there are other forms of economy. I save smiles for difficult days. I keep kind words for moments of tension. I stock up on patience to use with my more agitated grandchildren. I invest in moments with family, knowing that this is the best return I can have. In my emotional savings, I deposit small acts of kindness daily. A good morning to the doorman, help for the neighbor with groceries, a phone call to a friend who's been alone. These are investments that don't show up on the bank statement, but that enrich life in unimaginable ways. A few years ago, I started a special project. I write letters to my great-grandchildren who haven't been born yet. In them, I tell about the world I knew, the changes I witnessed, and the hopes I have for their future. Dear great-grandchild, I write, when you read this letter, I probably won't be here anymore, but I want you to know that long before you were born, I was already thinking about you. I want to tell you about a time when phones had wires, when we had to wait a week to develop photographs, when letters took days to arrive. In each letter, I put a small memento, an old photograph, a newspaper clipping, a leaf from my garden pressed between the pages. These are tangible pieces of history, bridges between my time and theirs. During the pandemic, when we were all isolated, I discovered that many old family recipes were being lost. No one knew how to make Grandma Antonia's pumpkin sweet anymore, or the cornbread my mother prepared on Sunday mornings. So I started rescuing these recipes. I called distant cousins, talked to elderly aunts, searched through old notebooks. Each recovered recipe brought with it a story. The cornmeal cake that was tradition at June festivals, the free-range chicken that brought the family together on Sundays. But I didn't just write down the ingredients and how to make them. Along with each recipe, I recorded the memories associated with it. This dulce de leche was your grandfather John's favorite. He said the secret was in the caramel point, which needed to be observed with patience and love. With age, I learned to listen to my body in a different way. It's no longer that anxious listening of youth, concerned with appearances and performances. It's a deeper, more respectful listening. Each pain, each limitation, brings its own lesson. When my knees started complaining about the stairs, I discovered new paths and rhythms. When tired eyes demanded stronger glasses, I learned to value other senses: touch, smell, sound. I developed my own exercise routine, adapted to my needs. Every morning I do stretches in the garden, talking to my plants. In the afternoon, I walk slowly through the neighborhood, observing the changes in houses, trees, people. One of the biggest lessons I've learned is that time has different flavors. There's chronological time, which marks the hours on the clock. There's heart time, which passes too quickly when we're happy and drags on in moments of sadness. And there's memory time, which preserves certain moments as if they were eternal. I learned not to waste time with regrets. The past is gone, and its lessons are stored in me. The future hasn't arrived yet, and about it, I have only hopes. What I truly have is the present, this precious moment I'm living now. Sometimes, sitting on my porch in the late afternoon, I think about the legacy I'll leave. I'm not talking about material goods. These are just things that time takes away. I'm talking about the legacy of love, stories, values that I've built along this journey. I want my grandchildren to remember not the grandpa who gave them presents, but the grandpa who taught them to plant jabuticaba trees, to tell stories, to respect the time of each thing. I want them to know that every wrinkle on my face was a shared smile, every white hair a lesson learned. Last week, my third great-grandson Michael was born. Holding that little being in my arms made me think about the miracle of time, the infinite cycle of life. I saw in his eyes the same sparkle I saw in my children's eyes, in my grandchildren's eyes. It's as if life was telling me, "See, Joseph, everything continues." I've learned to accept that I'm just a link in this great chain that is life. Each generation brings its own stories, its own struggles and achievements. My role now is to be a bridge between the past and the future, guardian of memories and sower of hopes. I come to the end of these memories with a heart full of gratitude. Gratitude for the long life that allowed me to see my children grow up, my grandchildren become adults, my great-grandchildren come into the world. Gratitude for each person who crossed my path and left a bit of themselves with me. Maria used to say that life is like a book. Each day is a new page, each year a different chapter. Some chapters are happy, others sad, but all are important to tell our story. Today, at 75, I know I still have many pages to write. I don't know how many there will be, but I know I want to fill them with love, with wisdom, with the simplicity I've learned to value. And if you who are reading these memories can learn something from me, let it be this. Life is too precious to be lived in a hurry. Each moment is an opportunity to love, to learn, to reinvent yourself. No matter your age, you can always start a new chapter. As the saying my mother repeated so often goes, life is not measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath away. And so, I close this book of memories, not with a full stop, but with an ellipsis. Because as long as there is life, there will be stories to tell, loves to live, moments to celebrate. With affection, Joe.